Let's jump into the coastal plain. So the coastal plain, we've already introduced it, but let's get into detail now on the coastal plain. The coastal plain is a flat plain. These are the flat plains, I guess. There are areas of the coastal plain. We're going to break it down into regions. These are flat plains along the southeastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. So you see the big, long Mediterranean Sea in your mind, Africa to the south, Europe to the north. Remember, Israel's tucked down into the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea, and all along that edge of the sea is this flat coastal plain that defines much of the travel in the biblical Near East throughout Israel's history. This, because of the flatness of the region, is providing easy lines of communication with Egypt and the rest of the world, greatly coveted by all of the nations, the main powerful nations of the world, and therefore always a cause of political, military, and commercial import to all of these nations. Egypt and the rest of the world is the easiest way to say it, and the coastal plain is in fact the way that you connect there. All right, so the coastal plain is going to be along the southeastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea and giving us access from the rest of the world to Egypt and Egypt to the rest of the world along this international coastal highway. We're going to divide the coastal plain into 4 districts. And again, in my mind, it's easier to break things up into pieces and to look at the way, in fact, the Bible itself defines and divides these regions. There are going to be 4. We're going to start in the south with Philistia. This is the area where the Philistines live, Philistia. Moving north, the plain of Sharon, which you probably have heard about. The Rose of Sharon, we'll see pictures of that. The plain of Dor, north of Sharon, kind of crammed in there between Mount Carmel as it juts into the sea and this little tiny strip of land, the plain of Dor. And then around the jut of Mount Carmel to the north, the plain of Asher, or the plain of Acco. Asher is the tribal name that inherited that region. Acco is the main city of that plain. And so it's called either the plain of Asher or the plain of Acco. Let's start in the south with Philistia. Of import to each one of those, we'll divide each one of these into their regional characteristics, their key cities, and then their lines of communication, or the way that you traveled through these 4 regions. Let's start with Philistia, the southernmost of the regions. Its characteristics are as follows. Philistia extends from Gaza. Has anyone in here heard of Gaza? Right? I mean, it's still, geography anticipates history. And here we are today talking about Gaza. It's on the news every day, right? And it's still called Gaza. It amazes me when I think of that. From Gaza, which was a city, a town, and now it's a hugely populated region, as you know. It extends from Gaza, coming out of Egypt, to Gaza, northward to Joppa and the Yarkon River. So we're going to say Philistia is from Gaza up to Joppa and the Yarkon River, and we'll talk about why that's important in just a moment. It's about 50 miles long from Gaza to Joppa. Joppa, by the way, is where modern Tel Aviv is today. Joppa, the old biblical city or mound, the Tel, as it's called, is engulfed by the modern city of Tel Aviv. From Gaza to Tel Aviv, or Joppa, is about 50 miles in length and about 12 miles wide from the Mediterranean over to the Shphelah, about 12 miles. Brown red sands, as we talked about earlier. It's a very sandy, it's kind of a dirty sand, I guess is the way I would describe it. And there are dunes, of course, next to, right in proximity to the coast itself. If you have ever traveled up the western side of Michigan, for example, and you've seen the big dunes that come off of the lake there, that's what's happening when wind is blowing off of the sea. And of course, the sea is creating sand, and that sand then is blowing up. So that right along the coast, there's going to be sand on the beach and then sand dunes. And that's kind of what is immediately next to the Mediterranean Sea, and then eventually this flat coastal plain. Brown red sands with dunes along the immediate coast, and it's really kind of a difficult marginal area as far as crops is concerned, because first of all, the ground is sandy. Secondly, we're farther south. The farther south, the drier. The farther north, the wetter, the more moisture, right? So we'll keep all that in mind. We are far south. It's going to be drier, and the ground is sandy. So when you water it, it's just going to suck it right down. And it's difficult to grow things in that region. So here's Philistia. From Gaza in the south here to Joppa and the Yarmuk River right here, this whole area is Philistia. You will notice even on this satellite map that there are sands along the coast here. This is the way the brown red sands look. If you can see clearly, it's maybe difficult. I don't know how well you can see, but there are, kind of the cliffs right here along the beach. This is more moderate. There aren't any cliffs here, but most of this area right in here is dunes. That's why even the modern cities are not built right next to the sea for the most part, because of this very sandy, duney kind of soil. The cities are five principal cities of Philistia, and they were actually city-states. In other words, each city had its own hegemony, its own governmental system. Each city had its own king. You're going to read a lot of times in the Old Testament about Abimelech. Abraham had dealings with Abimelech, and Abraham's children had dealings with Abimelech. Well, Abimelech in Hebrew, Av is father, Avi is my father, Melech is king. So Abimelech is my father is king. It's a titular name. It's a title. It's not the guy's name. It's his title. So Abimelech means I'm the king of some city, and they call me Abimelech. It's like my students call me Dr. Beacham. My name's Roy, right? But Dr. Beacham is not my name. Abimelech is not someone's name. It's their title, which is why it gets confusing at times to read the name Abimelech. In any case, each of these cities was independent of each other. The city itself would probably be walled and fortified. They would each have a king. There would be, villages around the walled cities that would belong to that city. Those villages are often called daughters. Sometimes the daughters of Jerusalem are talking about the villages that belong to the city of Jerusalem. So these cities would have kings, they would have villages that they owned, and then each of these 5 cities were their own independent city-state with their own king. Hopefully they'd get along with each other, but obviously they would unite to fight against a common enemy. So they had their own authority and lord. They were known as the Pentapolis, the 5 cities of the Philistines. 1 Samuel 6 makes reference to them. And when you think of the Bible, especially of the judges, you think of Samson judged in this region, not to mention, of course, that David had dealings with the Philistines, right? So let's look at these 5 cities. Gaza from the south, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, those are coastal cities. Then there are 2 inland cities. That's Gath and Ekron. And we will look at these cities in that order. Gaza, beginning in the south, along the coast. Ashkelon on the coast. Ashdod near the coast. And then Gath and Ekron inland from those other three principal cities. Let's start with the coastal cities, and we'll start with the most famous one, Gaza. Gaza was the southernmost city of Philistia, just off of the coast because of the dunes. So when you think of the Via Maris, you think of this international highway. The international highway, the coastal highway, is not running right on the coast. It's not like you can walk 10 yards off of the road and be in the Mediterranean Sea because of the sands and because of the dunes, right? So it's running inland, I'm going to say maybe a mile or so inland to avoid the sands and to avoid the dunes as it moves north-south from Egypt to the rest of the world and so forth. And so Gaza is the first major city, the Philistine city, that you would come to as you came out of Egypt on the Via Maris, heading to the rest of the world. Once you get to Gaza, you have entered the land of promise, but you've also entered Philistia. Okay, the southernmost city just off of the coast because of the dunes. Gaza and its surroundings served as the gateway to Egypt and the rest of the world. Why is Gaza such a politically hot commodity today? Well, because it's full of Arab people that, for better or worse, I mean, it's a discussion that would be fun to have, but they are crammed in there between Egypt, which, you know, they're not Egyptians, and Egypt is not interested in assimilating them, and they're not, you know, part of Israel. They have their own independent city, and they want to run things themselves, but obviously there's conflict between not only them and Egypt to some extent, less conflict there, but there's conflict between them and Israel. It's right there between Egypt and Israel, even today, and therefore is conflicted. North of Gaza is Ashkelon. Ashkelon was their port city. So think about this. The road is running about a mile inland to avoid the dunes, but you want a port city, so you're going to build a city off of the main highway about a mile to get over to the coast. So Ashkelon is actually on the coast. You have to travel about a mile, let's say, from Ashkelon to the main north-south highway because of the sand dunes, but they wanted a port, and so Ashkelon became the port city of Philistia, slightly off the major road, directly on the coast. The Philistines are thought to have come from Aegea, from the area of the Aegean Sea up in Europe, I think Greece. Some think they were called the Sea Peoples who migrated. They tried to infiltrate Egypt. They were repelled. They ended up settling here on the coast of the Promised Land, but they were Sea Peoples. Their god was Dagon, was a fish god. By the way, Dagon, literally, if you pronounced it in the Hebrew pronunciation, is Dagon, which sounds kind of weird to us. Because even more weird, hang on to your hats, the Hebrew word, the Semitic word for fish is dog. So Jonah was not swallowed by a great fish. He was swallowed by a great dog. Teach that one to your Sunday school kids. Because dog means fish in Hebrew. But anyway, Dagon is their fish god. He's their main god. They are a sea peoples. They want a coastal city. That is Ashkelon. The next city, coastal city to the north, you have Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. Like Gaza, Ashdod is not directly on the coast. It's on the main route. It's overseeing this Via Maris to the rest of the world from Egypt. This city had a temple to Dagon, where the Ark of the Covenant was placed after its capture from Israel by the Philistines. By the way, I forgot to do this. I kind of want to, before every class, I want to review a biblical story for you. Because remember, I talked about, you envisioning things happening, and you've heard this story before. The Philistines were fighting with Israel. That battle happened at Aphek. Israel came down from Shiloh. They set up a camp at Ebenezer. They fought the Philistines, and Israel lost the battle at Aphek. So what did the Israelites decide to do? Well, maybe if we brought God into our camp, he's going to help us. So they went back to Shiloh. They got the Ark of the Covenant. They brought it down to their camp at Ebenezer, which was right next to Aphek, where the Philistines were encamped. They fought again, thinking that maybe God would deliver, would deliver the Philistines into their hand. But what happened? They lost again to the Philistines at the Battle of Aphek, and the ark was captured. The ark was taken from Aphek to Ashdod. That didn't go so well. They sent it away to Gath. It didn't go so well there. They sent it away to Ekron. That didn't go so well. They put it on a cart and said, let's get rid of this thing. They sent it back to Israel. It ended up at Bethshemesh. You've heard that story many times, but until now, I mean, you have not one of those cities you've heard of, but you don't know where to place those events. Why were they fighting at Aphek? Well, in just a minute, you're going to see why they were fighting at Aphek, and you're going to see where was Shiloh compared to that? Where did they bring the ark to Ebenezer by Aphek? Why fighting at Aphek? And when the ark was captured, why did it go to Ashdod? And then why did it go to Gath? And then why did it go to Ekron? And why did they send it back to Israel and ended up at Bethshemesh? You've heard that story many times. In a few minutes, you're going to know exactly where all those places are and why it happened that way. So here we go. We've seen Gaza. We've seen Ashkelon on the port. Ashdod now, again, has moved off of the sea about a mile onto the main road. It's the northernmost coastal town of Philistia. And this is where they had a temple to this fish god. And it's where the ark was first brought to that temple after the battle at Aphek in 1 Samuel chapter 5. We'll look at that battle in a moment. So there's Gaza, Ashkelon. Remember, Gaza is inland on the main road. Ashkelon is on the coast as their port. Ashdod is back on the main road. And these are our coastal Philistine cities. Our next two are inland. There are two inland areas of cities of Philistia, which we'll look at in just a minute. But let's get a feel visually for these areas. Here's modern Gaza. Actually, this picture is very old, and Gaza has spread on to this whole area. Here you'll see Gaza tucked all the way up onto the coast, but ancient Gaza, the Tel, let me talk about the word Tel, because Tel Aviv. I'm going to talk about the Tel of Megiddo, the Tel of this, T-E-L, or sometimes spelled T-E-L-L. The word Tel is, again, a Hebrew word, Semitic word, for a mound, a ruined city mound. It's the mound where an ancient city sat. There's no evidence of that city anymore, but the big mound where it used to be is visible. So if we talk about Tel Gaza, it's the ancient city of Gaza that has been destroyed. The reason it's a mound is because those cities were destroyed so many times. The city was built, it was destroyed and leveled. They came in and built another city on top of that. It's destroyed and leveled. Megiddo has something like 28 levels. Megiddo, because it's in one of those cracks in Mount Carmel, and everybody's conquering it and destroying it, rebuilding it, conquer, destroy. So these mounds get higher and higher. You drive through Israel, and here's this mound over there. It's like, oh, that was an old city, and that's the ones they excavate, and they hopefully they'll find a biblical city, and they found most of those now. But in any case, Tel Gaza would have been off of the coast, but here's the modern city 20, 30 years ago of Gaza. Now this is all filled up with, as you see on the news, with encampments and so forth. Here's an old Israeli bunker, imagine that, looking into Gaza, right? From back in the probably 80s or 90s. But even back then, this is militarily significant because it's an area that's hostile to Israel, but it's also in conflict with Egypt, and people are just kind of crammed in there and living a subsistence kind of life, trying to survive with all of the political ramifications that are happening there. Here's Ashkelon. You've seen this picture before. I showed you the brown red sands. The ancient tell is actually right in here. And so it is on the coast. It's built on the coast. This was the port city of Philistia because they were peoples of the sea. Here's an ancient picture that they found of their god Dagon or Dagon, and you'll see if you look closely that there's a fish right here. His hat is a fish head and a fish mouth, and here are the scales, and here's the tail. This is the god of the sea. This is Dagon, the chief god of the Philistines. Here is Tel Ashkelon, or there's a modern Israeli park, a national park at Ashkelon. It's really a very beautiful region, and I can show you ruins after ruin, pictures of ruins. Everywhere you go, there are ruins of ancient cities that were built on these places, even not just back in the days of the Philistines, but as they were conquered by various nations and so forth. Eventually, the Romans are going to build beautiful cities with pillars and statues and so forth. They have discovered years ago, and perhaps they've discovered far more now, they discovered Canaanite walls in Ashkelon, probably from the time of the conquest. I mean, it's amazing. I've been to like Philadelphia, and you see these historic buildings that are part of American history, 250 years ago. And then you go to Israel and you stand in the palace of Ahab and Jezebel from 2,500 years ago. It's amazing. So here are Canaanite walls from ancient Palestine or the land of promise, where Israel was sent in to conquer these Canaanites, Canaanite gate that they've discovered, a mud brick gate. And no doubt, again, they discover so much more. Every time you go, there are new things to see. That was Ashkelon on the sea, the port city. Here's Ashdod. We've moved now back inland to this northern of the coastal cities. This is the ruins, the tell. It's kind of hard to tell that this is an elevated space, but this is where the ancient city would have been. They start digging there and they find all kinds of ruins from ancient times to Roman times. The Arabs built, this is an Arab port. The Arabs built their port at Ashdod instead of Ashkelon. So, I mean, the history there is fantastic. The things they find are amazing. But those are our three coastal cities in Philistia: Gaza, Ashkelon, which was the port, and then Ashdod. Let's move inland to Gath and Ekron, all right? If you're looking at your map, you can see where these are. Gath was east of Ashkelon and Ashdod. It was on an inland north-south route near the Shephelah Hills. It stood at the mouth of the Elah Valley of the Shephelah. Remember, the Shephelah are those low hills that lead up to the hill country. And so the Shephelah is important strategically as a buffer between the coast and Philistia in this case. So if you can control cities at the mouth of those Shephelah valleys, you're going to control access up into the hill country. That's why, Gath is the hometown of Goliath, who is fighting David in the Shephelah. Why? Gath is an important city, not because it's on the coast and on the main route, but it's on an eastern branch of the main route that also is leading into the Shephelah, which leads up to the hills where Israel is mostly confined. And so there's constant conflict, but Gath is a strategic city, not just in Philistia on the coast, but also at the mouth of one of these Shephelah valleys. Tomorrow, we'll look at the Shephelah and more specifically at those valleys. This was the second stop of the ark. When the ark was sent away from Ashdod because of what the bad things that were happening there because they had the Ark of God. They sent it to Gath. This was also the home of Goliath. And strangely enough, this is hard to figure out, but David fled to Gath as a refuge when he was fleeing from Saul. So we're going to read a lot about Gath in the scriptures. It's one of the inland cities of Philistia, and we'll talk more about that and the routes in just a minute. Ekron is north of Gath. This is the last of our 5 Philistine cities north of Gath, also on this inland route near another valley of the Shephelah, the Sorek Valley. And that may sound familiar because that's the valley where Samson was mostly interacting with the Philistines. In the Sorek Valley, this was the final stopping place of the ark when it went from the Battle of Aphek to Ashdod, then to Gath, and then here to Ekron. This is where they sent it back into Israel. And of course, that oxen cart on which they sent it went up the Sorek Valley. We'll look at that valley tomorrow with regard to the Shephelah. So there's Gath and there is Ekron. Those are our 5 major Philistine cities. Here is Tel Gath. You can see it in the distance here. Tel Gath is a huge mound, very high. You can see it from a far distance. Here we're getting closer to it. And hopefully, eventually, if you have time on your trip, walking up on top of Tel Gath, you can see, a road down here. There's a vehicle parked right here, if you can see that. It gives you a perspective as to how tall this thing is. It's just a huge mound on which, cities were built on hills, right? Because they're easier to defend. And so they're built on hills to start with, and then as they're destroyed, the hill gets bigger and bigger. And this is Tel Gath, a very, very important Philistine city, overlooking not just the coast, but also the Shephelah. Now we're on top of Tel Gath. We're looking more or less to the east. And so you see that ridge in the far distance horizon. That's the hill country. That's that watershed ridge of the hill country that's running north and south, those deep V-shaped valleys that are running off of that watershed ridge. That's where the Jews were living most of the time, up in those hills. You can see the low rolling hills around that with these fertile valleys, broad valleys, leading up toward the hill country. And we're standing on top of Gath, which is where the Philistines are controlling not only this north-south route, a little inland from the main road, but also the valley that's leading up here to the hill country and defending them against Israel. And the Shephelah becomes a defense for Israel against the Philistines. It's that buffer zone between the two that they're constantly going to be fighting over. Tel Ekron, north of Gath, is smaller. It's lower. It's not as high. It took them a long time to figure out that this Tel was in fact Ekron. They're virtually certain that it is. Therefore, they have done a great deal of excavation. I believe there's a little museum that the kibbutz people there have built, and they have some descriptions of what the city may have looked like back in its day. This is Tel Ekron, the last and the northernmost, the northeasternmost of the Philistine cities. So that's the region and what it's like. That's the cities of the region. Now let's talk about the routes. Let's talk about how you travel through that region, and you already have an idea of how that's working. We have this major international trunk highway, the Via Maris, the international road through ancient Israel from Egypt to the rest of the world to Egypt. That's right on the coast, as close as it can get, avoiding the sands. It's going through Gaza and Ashdod. That's the main trunk highway called in the Old Testament the Via Maris, the way of the sea. We'll look at Isaiah a little later during the week. So beginning in Egypt, the trunk highway traveled slightly inland to avoid the dunes along the sea. The thoroughfare passed through Philistia, specifically Gaza and Ashdod, because Ashkelon is off a little bit on the coast. It traveled through Philistia. It touches the coast at Joppa, which we're going to look at in a moment. It's going to touch the coast at Joppa. Joppa is going to be the port city of Israel. When Jonah fled the Lord, he went to a port and got on a boat. Where did he go? He fled to Joppa. It's the port of Israel. Ashkelon's the port for Philistia. Joppa's the port for Israel. And so the road's coming up from Egypt. It goes through Gaza. It passes Ashkelon. It goes through Ashdod, and it's going to turn on back out to the coast and touch the coast at Joppa, because that is a port city. And then it's going to turn inland. It's turned sharply east-northeast to avoid a river, the Yarkon River, which runs between these two dots right here, and the swamps of Sharon. The next coastal plain we'll look at is the Plain of Sharon. The Plain of Sharon, we're going to discover, was farther north. There's more moisture. It's flat and it's fertile and it gets a lot of rain. But because of the way things happened after the flood, there were some natural dams that were created that caused the Plain of Sharon to become very swampy. So once you hit Joppa, you want to avoid the Yarkon River. You want to avoid the swamps of Sharon. And so the main road is going to hug the hills of Samaria, the northern hills. It's going to hug those hills to avoid the swamps and the sands of the Plain of Sharon. And then it's going to go through one of these cracks into the Esdraelon Valley. I've got the Megiddo Pass here, Harmageddon. And then it's going to go up to the rest of the world. So, beginning in Egypt, travel slightly inland to avoid the dunes along the sea. We're going to hit Gaza, pass Ashkelon to Ashdod. We're going to join the sea there at Joppa, and then we have to turn inland to avoid that Yarkon River, to hug the hills of Samaria so we can get into the Megiddo Pass and head to the rest of the world. That's the main road through the land of promise. Now, there is a secondary branch of this international route that runs farther inland. This byway, I call it, is going to hug the western edge of the Shephelah. It's the one that you see branching out here south of Gaza, going east, hugging the hills of the Shephelah. And notice Gath and Ekron are on this inland route. Now, because I'm a Minnesota guy, I call these 35W and 35E. I don't know if you have anything here to compare to that. But if you've driven through the cities, you get to a point south of Minneapolis where you've got to decide, I'm going to go on 35W or 35E. That's exactly what's happening here. South of Gaza, the main road is 35W. It's going right along the coast. But if you want to avoid that for military reasons, for taxation reasons, for whatever reasons, you're going to go inland to 35E. You're going to go past Gath and Ekron, but both of those roads are going to join again where the road turns from Joppa and heads to the hills of Samaria. The city there, that dot, is Aphek. Remember Aphek? I just talked about the Battle of Aphek. Why would Aphek, see where that dot is? Why would Aphek be an important city? Class? No matter whether you travel 35W or 35E, you're going to go through Aphek, right? Because the two join again at Aphek. That's why the Philistines were fighting Israel, and Israel was fighting the Philistines at Aphek, because to control Aphek is to control 35W and 35E. How important is that? So the secondary branch, 35E, farther inland, hugging the western edge of the Shephelah, joining the main branch of the trunk highway at Aphek and the Yarkon River. So here comes 35W, Gaza, just bypassing Ashkelon, which is on the coast, Ashdod, turning in at Joppa, and then having to turn northeast because the Yarkon River runs between Aphek and Joppa, and the plains of Sharon are swampy. You've got to move inland to Aphek and hug the hills of Samaria in order to get up there to Megiddo and through one of those cracks of the Carmel Range. Here comes 35E. Farther inland, in fact, you'll see a modern road right here. The inland, 35E, going past Gath and Ekron, but joining at Aphek with 35W because of the Yarkon River and the swamps of Sharon. That's how you travel through Philistia, which means that's how the entire world, Egypt and the rest of the world, are intersecting with the land of promise and the land of Israel. That's Philistia. Let's move north then to the Plain of Sharon, and we've talked a little bit about it. The Plain of Sharon, before we get to Dor and Acco, the Plain of Sharon, the region itself, as I have mentioned, is extends from Joppa and the Yarkon River, which heads over to Aphek. It extends from Joppa and the Yarkon River and Aphek northward to the Crocodile River or the Tananim River, just south of the Carmel Ridge. So let's say from Joppa to about where the Mount Carmel juts into the sea, that area from Joppa to Mount Carmel, the southern part of Mount Carmel, that's the Plain of Sharon. There's going to be another little river, the Crocodile River, that's going to define the northern edge of Sharon. So the Yarkon River in the south to the Crocodile River in the north is the Plain of Sharon. All right? It's characterized, as I said, by regional whiter sand dunes. The sand now is more like the sand that maybe we think of. My mom grew up in Mobile. We used to go to Gulf Shores and Orange Beach, and I mean the beautiful white sand of the Gulf. That's more like the Plain of Sharon. These are white sands, but also greater dunes. The dunes are higher because there aren't as many cliffs along the sea. It's more flat up there. But also in Old Testament times, this whole region was swampy. I'd love to spend time describing why that happened. When the flood, I shouldn't do this, but here we go. When the flood receded and all that water is washing off of the plains of Samaria, if you've ever walked down the beach of the Gulf, for example, maybe even on the Atlantic or Pacific coast, I'm more familiar with the Gulf, and you see the tide has gone out and you'll see ridges of debris, 2 or 3 ridges where the tide went out and then stopped and then stopped. And there's just ridges of shells and seaweed and stuff. As the flood receded off of the hills down into the Mediterranean, these ridges of marine life that died in the flood were left along this area, and of course they're going to run north and south as the sea recedes to the west, and those calcified, they're already calcium, they're shells that calcified to become something called Kurkar, and these hard Kurkar ridges formed north and south that impeded the water then to flow from the hills out to the sea, and they're backing up behind these Kurkar ridges, and the whole area then became quite swampy. It wasn't until the Romans came along, and of course they had enough slave labor and enough technology to know how to dig through these Kurkar ridges and let the water flow out so they could drain the swamps of Sharon. But in Old Testament times, this is a very swampy area. Now it's north, it's flat, it's fertile. So it's a great area to grow stuff if you can deal with the swamps, right? But that's the characteristics of the Plain of Sharon, especially during Old Testament times. Here it is on our map. From the Yarkon River by Joppa up to the Crocodile River, where you see the Mount Carmel start to jut out into the sea. That's the Plain of Sharon. far smaller than the plain of Philistia. There it is from Joppa and Aphek to the southern edge of the Sea of Galilee. The cities, there are going to be two important cities in the Plain of Sharon. The first, well, actually not in the Plain of Sharon. Joppa is just south of the Plain of Sharon. Joppa is near Lod, or Old Testament. The New Testament name for Lod is Lydda. And so I kind of think of Joppa and Aphek and Lod as kind of a triangle. And we don't talk much about Lod. If you travel to Israel, you're going to land at their major airport, which is called Lod, because the airport was built where Lod, or Lydda, the Old Testament Lydda is. This is Lod Airport. And so Joppa, Lod, Aphek form a kind of triangle. You can see them on your map here. Joppa, Lod, Aphek form a kind of a triangle here. Joppa is what we're focusing on. Joppa is the Old Testament port city for the nation of Israel. And that's what I just said. It's major or Old Testament regional port. Timber, this is where timber was floated from Lebanon up north of Galilee. Hiram floated, logs down for Solomon to build the temple. They were hauled here to Joppa by sea, and then they start to wind their way up to the hill country and up to Jerusalem, which we will connect to in the next couple of days. 2 Chronicles chapter 2. Jonah boarded a ship in Joppa. It's the port. He went from his hometown, which was up in Galilee. He was supposed to go north to Nineveh, and he went south to Joppa and got on a ship, and we know the rest of that story. Peter healed a man in Lod, or Lydda, in Acts chapter 9. Then he moved to Joppa. Joppa is where he raised Dorcas from the dead. It's where Peter saw the vision of the unclean animals, and God said, eat. And Peter said, no, I'm not going to eat. Those are unclean. And God said, I'm making them clean, eat. And then God said, Peter, you need to go to some Gentiles and you need to share the gospel with them in Caesarea. That's going to be our next city. But all of that stuff is happening. Now, when you read your Bibles, you're not going to remember all this stuff, but you have your notes. And now, as you read your Bible, here's something I strongly recommend you do. If you want to get an old Bible, fine, get an old Bible. Start to read through it, just looking at place names, looking at regional names, looking at and marking that in your Bible. Oh, there's Joppa, there's Lod, there's the hill country, there's the low hills, or the Shephelah. Very few English translations will say Shephelah, but they'll say low hills, or Philistia, or Ashdod. Start to underline those and think about where they are, because this is God's chessboard for testing his people Israel, right? It's just so important. All right. So much happened at Joppa. Modern Tel Aviv has swallowed up ancient Joppa, but there is a little tell of old Joppa that you can visit if you go to Tel Aviv. You can see today a modern breakwater that they have built so that boats can come in here and be protected from the waves of the sea. But this was, in fact, Israel's port cities in the days of Solomon and following. This is how they accessed the Mediterranean Sea. There's a very beautiful little park there. I'm looking north from the park at Joppa into modern Tel Aviv. But again, this is our access to the coast. If you look out into the water from the park where ancient Joppa stood, you can see these stones out in the water. Those are doubtless parts of walls that were the ancient breakwater, because this was a port city, and that would be the ancient breakwater, allowing ships to come in behind this little wall to be protected from the waves of the sea. And of course, there are ruins everywhere you go that you can see and study, and they'll tell you when they were built and so forth. And also, I haven't mentioned this yet, you who've been to Israel know this, every place something happened in the Bible, somebody's built a church. This is the very spot where Peter had the vision of the, okay, well, I'm sorry, I love telling stories. We had a guide once. The first trip I ever took I ever led was a 21-day trip, and our guide was a premier guide. He was an old guy who'd guided for many, many years. He knew the land upside down backwards. He said, you people want to walk up every hill you see and get to the top of it and talk about what's going on up here. But he said, you know what? He said, I love being with your group because you know our land and you love our land and you want to see our land. He said, when you guys leave, my next group is 3 busloads of people from, I think, I'm going to say Italy, from somewhere like Italy. And they come from a particular religious slant, which I won't name specifically, but Italy, okay? And he says, 3 busloads of people, and they want me to drive them from church to church to church because they're going to have a mass at every church. And I'm going to sit in the bus waiting for them to do a mass so I can go to the next church and they're going to do a mass. He said, I love your group. I want to do what you guys are doing. And that's the kind of trip you want to be on. So you'll see these churches. Don't worry about going in all the churches where something happened. Very few of those churches know where anything happened. But in any case, here's the church where Peter saw his vision. All right. The road is coming to Joppa. That's the coastal town. They build a breakwater. That's where they can access the rest of the world through the Mediterranean Sea. But then it hits the road coming out of Egypt to Joppa, hits the Yarmouk River. It has to turn inland. It goes over to Aphek, and here is Aphek. The New Testament name for it is Antipatris, and it is northeast of Joppa. Aphek is located on the Via Maris as it turns inland from Joppa to avoid the Yarkon, to avoid the swamps of Sharon, rejoins the secondary route, 35E, right? They're coming together now again at Aphek. That route that ran inland next to the Shephelah now is joining the main route at Aphek. Talk about strategic city, right? As a junction city, Aphek was most strategic in defending the coastal plain and the international highway in ancient times. Most strategic in defending the coastal plain. When I give my students quizzes, I'll ask them stuff like this. If you could own one city on the coastal plain, if you're Solomon and you can own one city, just one city on the coastal plain, which one will you want? And it's fun to hear them debate, right? I mean, Gaza is right at the gate of Egypt. Okay. Joppa is your coastal city. I mean, it's how you get to the rest of everything else. But then there's what? Aphek, which everybody's trying, that's the hard decision for Solomon. If I only get one of these, which one do I want? There are advantages and disadvantages to each one, but they're all put in exactly the right place by God because all kinds of things he wants to happen there to test his people, right? This is a most strategic city in defending the coastal plain. All the nations of the world are coming through, let's say, the Megiddo Pass, Mount Carmel, and they're coming here to Aphek before they can decide to go 35 ERW down to Egypt. So for Samuel 4, the Battle of Aphek. For Samuel 29, the Battle of Jezreel was staged at Aphek. It's up. The battle's going to be fought up in the Jezreel Valley, up there north of Mount Carmel, but it's staged at Aphek. That is, the Philistines gathered their troops at Aphek because there are 5 cities, right? They gathered at Aphek to go fight up in the Jezreel Valley. So, as you read your Bible, the stuff now begins to make some sense. Remember the lines of communication that come from Egypt through Philistia. Beginning in Egypt, major highway is traveling north along the coast. It crosses through Philistia. It touches the coast at Joppa. It turns sharply east toward Aphek to avoid the Yarkon River and the swamps of Sharon, the secondary branch, is running farther inland, hugging the edge of the Shephelah and joining the main trunk at Aphek. Here comes 35W, touching Joppa, and then turning into Aphek. Here comes 35E, Gath and Ekron, joining together again at Aphek. Everything is funneling toward Aphek. I love this, this satellite picture because here's Aphek, and you can see here the Yarkon River. In fact, modern Tel Aviv, if they want to get from this part of Tel Aviv to the suburbs to the north, they have to build bridges to get across the Yarkon. And you will actually see modern roads coming, hitting the Yarkon and turning this way and going around Aphek and heading north. So modern roads even are joining here at Aphek because of the Yarkon River and the swamps of Sharon. Of course, the swamps of Sharon are no longer an issue. But this is historic Aphek. This is a satellite view from Google Earth. We're looking straight down at Aphek. North is up, okay, is toward the top here. And here's the Tell. Here's the ancient city up on this mound. And I want you to notice, remember, look at everything around there. Don't just look at the middle of this picture. First, I want you to notice a road coming from the west. It's coming from Tel Aviv, from the Mediterranean. And it's coming around Aphek, and it's joining this main road, this like 4-lane, 6-lane road that's going straight north toward Megiddo, the Megiddo Pass and the Carmel Ridge. Technically, I think it's going to the Jokneam Pass, but whatever. It's heading north toward the Carmel Ridge, and everything, again, is coming from the coast, joining here at Aphek and heading north. Here is our strategic city controlling this intersection. It's amazing. Another amazing thing about this picture is, notice there's no water, there's no Yarkon River, there's nothing over here on the east side of this highway. But when you look at Aphek, you see ponds and trees and the beginning of the Yarkon River. Why is that happening? Because underneath this mound is a spring, and water is gushing out from underground, under Aphek, near Aphek, and feeding the Yarkon River, which runs virtually all year long because of these gushing springs that are coming from Aphek. We read about springs in the Bible. Springs are an important thing. And when water falls up in the hills and soaks down into the ground and it hits an impermeable layer somewhere down, underneath the mountain, and it runs along that impermeable layer, and it's going to break out somewhere and gush out of the bottom of this mountain, this hill. That's happening here at Aphek, which is, again, why the road is turning in. It's why the Yarkon is there, and it's why everything can funnel around the east side of Aphek, because of the springs that are happening there. That's all of these things are making this an important city. It's at a strategic crossroad, right? And it has water. You can't have a city without water, right? And it has all of those things. What an important place. This is, again, kind of an aerial view where you can see some of the ruins at Aphek, which I'll talk about in a minute. You can see the waters being preserved there as it begins to feed the Yarkon River. Here, the ruins you see at Aphek are a Turkish fortress. Class. Why would the Turks build a fortress here? It's what it was in Old Testament. I mean, this is the time of the Turks, whatever years though were medieval. I'm not a history guy, but here they are building a fortress at Aphek. Why? The same reason the Philistines wanted it, the same reason the Jews, the same reason the Egyptians wanted it, the same reason the Babylonians wanted it, the Greeks wanted it, the Romans wanted it. Here's a Turkish fortress. And it's interesting to see, but it's not biblical. I love standing there and looking down at that pool of water that's feeding the ark on and causing everything to come around the city and head to the north. The Battle of Aphek is where they lost the Ark of the Covenant. Remember, I recounted that story for you before you heard the story and you heard these place names, but you had no idea what that had to do with anything in reality. Let me read it to you now. It's going to be a new way of seeing the Bible, right? Here it is. I'll try to be quick here. 1 Samuel 4. Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. Israel encamped at Ebenezer, it's what they named their camp, and the Philistines camped at Aphek. The Philistines were up in line in Israel. Israel was defeated. The troops came to the camp, the elders of Israel. Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let's bring the Ark of the Covenant down from Shiloh. So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of hosts to see if God, if he's in their camp, is going to help them. Well, let's look at our map. There's Shiloh. There's Aphek. Shiloh is right up. See that water system? I call it the Shiloh system. These rivers that are running off of the hills. Shiloh is up in the hill country. And this river system that's running down and also feeding the Yarkon when it's rainy, Shiloh is just east of Aphek. It's only a few miles. Let's go up and get the ark at Shiloh. Let's bring it down. And maybe God, if he's in our camp, is going to help us win this battle. The Philistines were afraid. They heard that the ark had come. You know, their God has come into their camp. Woe is us. Nothing like this has happened before. Verse 9. Take courage, be men, Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Fight, even though their God is here, let's fight. And they fought a second time, and Israel was again defeated. Well, Israel isn't obeying God. They're not following God. They're not trusting God, and Israel is defeated. And they lost the Ark of God. The Ark of God, verse 11, was captured. When the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer, the camp by Aphek, to Ashdod. Now we know where that is, the northernmost of the coastal cities of Philistia. Into the house of Dagon, their fish god. They set it up by Dagon. We know the story. Dagon fell down. The next morning, Dagon had fallen down before the ark. They put Dagon back up. The next day, Dagon had not only fallen down, but his hands and his head had broken off. And so verse 6, the hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod. He afflicted them with tumors. They gathered together the lords of the Philistines, and they said, let the ark of God of Israel be brought around to Gath. Let's get it out of here. Let's send it to our buddies over in Gath. Now we know where Gath is, right? Gath is directly east of Ashdod on the 35E, the inland route. But the hand of the Lord was against the city of Gath. The tumors broke out. So they sent it to Ekron. Nice people, right? Let's send it north up to our northern inland city, Ekron. As soon as God came there, Ekron cried out. Verse 11, send away the ark of Israel and let it return to its own place. And so they put it on a cart pulled by milk cows, of all things. They took the babies away from the milk cows. They had just given birth to babies. My wife grew up on a dairy farm. You know what it's like when the baby calves, she said she used to cry when the baby calves were taken away from their moms, because their moms, the babies are crying and the moms are crying. They want to be back together. So they took the ark, they put milk cows on it, and they kept the babies back, and they said if the cows come back to their babies, we'll know that this just was a coincidence. But if the cows leave their babies and take the ark into Israel, we'll know God was in this. And of course, the cows left and took the ark into Israel, and right up the valley from Ekron is Beth Shemesh in the Shephelah, and that's where the ark ended up. And you know the rest of the story. So here we are, Shiloh. And the ark is brought to Aphek. The ark is lost. It was taken down to Ashdod. They didn't like what happened. They sent it to Gath. They sent it to Ekron, and they said, let's put it on a cart and see where it ends up. And they sent it right up this valley right here, and it ended up at Beth Shemesh. And we'll talk about that valley tomorrow when we look at the Shephelah. My point is, that hopefully after today and after this week, your Bible is just going to start to say, oh, wow, now I get it. I understand why that is happening. Okay, the Sharon Plain north of the Yukon. Despite the swamps and the sands of the Sharon Plain, the abundant water suited parts of it for lush grain fields and fertile pasture lands. 1 Chronicles 5 talks about that. You can look up these passages later. So it's farther north. There's plenty of rain. It's flat, beautiful, dark soil that is washed off of the mountains. If you can keep away from the sands that are blowing in from the sea, and if you can somehow deal with the swamps, it's a great place, a lush place to grow crops. In fact, in the restored kingdom, when Jesus comes again and restores the kingdom to Israel, don't get me started on that topic. I could go for hours. When Jesus comes again and restores this kingdom and this property to Israel, here's how Isaiah describes restored Israel. Isaiah 35, the wilderness and the dry land, that's the word Negev, I believe. The wilderness and the Negev. Remember, you've seen one picture of the Negev, the wilderness, you've seen them all, right? That dry, barren, desolate land, when the Lord comes back and restores the kingdom to Israel, the wilderness and the Negev will be glad. The desert, that's the word Arava, which is the southern, that's the Dead Sea and south. The Arava will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly, rejoice. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it. The majesty of Carmel, Mount Carmel, and Sharon. Now we know where Carmel is. We know where Sharon is. We know how abundant and moisture-filled and fertile it is up there. And the Negev, where you've seen one picture, you've seen them all, is going to look like the plain of Sharon. And the mountain of Carmel and all the abundance of the trees of Lebanon. Now these passages should make sense to us. And I hope you fall in love with it. You're reading along in Isaiah. It says, wow, now I know where this place is, and I know what this looks like. Here's the plain of Sharon. This is an interesting picture because as we look toward the Mediterranean, toward the west, flying over it, you can see the sand dunes, right? This is all sand. It's blown in from the sea and made great dunes here. But once you get away from the sand, here's a modern road, avoiding the sand. But here's this fertile, dark soil that is washed off of the hills of Samaria. Once the swamps are drained, or if you can avoid the swampy areas, you can grow these abundant, fertile crops. Here's the rose of Sharon. It's a little, I mean, maybe somebody here who's a gardener knows the proper name. It's a tiny, it doesn't even look like a rose, but the rose of Sharon is mentioned in Song 2 as a symbol of his beautiful wife. Back to the coastal plain, but let's move to the major city of the Sharon Plain, and that is Caesarea. Caesarea is a Roman city. The only reason Caesarea can exist is because the Romans figured out how to drain the swamps of Sharon, and having drained the swamps of Sharon, they built a huge city that became, in New Testament times, the port city of this region. So little Joppa fades into the background. Caesarea becomes the Roman port city and the big player, one of the biggest players of Rome in the land of promise. And that is right here on the northern part of the Sharon Plain. Caesarea was a stunning Roman city built by Herod the Great. And when you travel in Israel, you will see buildings by Herod the Great all over the place. He was an amazing builder as well as an amazing and somewhat tyrannical and crazy ruler, but he did build a lot. And Caesarea was one of his cities prior to New Testament times, after the Romans drained the swamps of Sharon, named after Caesar Augustus, Caesarea, Caesar's town. It became the regional port and the provincial capital of Rome in this region. A lot of things happen in Caesarea. We don't have time to look at all of them. I list them here. They're in the notes. You can certainly look them up. This is where Pontius Pilate lived. In fact, they found when they were excavating Caesarea, they were uncovering the theater that they discovered. They found a stone with Pontius Pilate's name engraved on it as probably some kind of monument to him, confirming, of course, what the Bible says is true. He existed and was a ruler in Caesarea. This was also the home of Cornelius. Remember when Peter was sent to give the gospel to Gentiles, he saw the unclean animals and God said, eat of them. And Peter said, no way. And God said, yes, things are changing. I'm going to send you to a Gentile. That's Cornelius. And that happens here at Caesarea. He's coming from Joppa. Herod Agrippa died here. In fact, Pastor Jesse read this passage the other day. Paul stood trial here. This is where Paul was brought from Jerusalem to stand trial, where he appealed to Caesar and was sent to Rome, because this is the port, sent to Rome. Paul was in this place, and we're going to show you where Paul was. He stood here before Felix, Festus, and Agrippa in Acts chapter 23 and 25. Here's an aerial view of Caesarea. There's so much to see here. You can spend a couple hours easily at Caesarea. There's a theater. There is Herod's palace near the theater. There is an amphitheater, which is probably where large public events took place, where there was the bema seat where judgment would be pronounced by the rulers. There are public buildings that have been excavated with beautiful mosaics and so forth. There is a Roman road. There is an ancient harbor. Of course, this was the provincial capital of Rome in this area, and a huge artificial harbor was built here with the breakwaters and so forth, which we'll talk about in a moment. There's a Crusader fortress. Why are the Crusaders building a fortress at Caesarea? The same reason that biblical people were interested in fortifying Caesarea. And so there's a more modern Crusader fortress. There's a hippodrome where the horse races would take place outside of the city a little bit. There's just so much to see at Caesarea. Here's a diagram, a drawn diagram of the ancient port of Caesarea, which also another name for Caesarea is Sebastos. This was a large artificial port that was built. And today you're going to see, if you can see in this little tiny map here, I hope you can, there's a little old breakwater here, but if you look, and I'll show you better pictures in a moment, if you look at the dark area under the water here, these are ancient stones of the breakwater. In fact, they eventually, I forget, back in the 80s, 90s, they had divers go down and excavate this under, below the water, breakwater, and so forth. And one of our trips, we had a young man by the name of Pat Brinkman, who was a diver who actually was unsaved at the time, but he went to Caesarea, and he's one of the divers who actually did some of this study of the underground. But it was a huge artificial breakwater port that was created. These ships, these massive ships are harbored here with all kinds of storage places and so forth, bringing masses of material and Roman troops and so forth to this important port city. Here's an aerial view of the theater, which is one of the first things that they discovered and uncovered, this Roman theater. The Israeli symphony plays pretty consistently here, I believe, at least they used to, and I think they perhaps still do. Very ornate theater with incredible acoustics. You can sit up in the top and hear people speaking in normal voice down at the bottom. Here is the stone that they found with Pontius Pilatus engraved on it here, confirming, of course, what the Bible already said. This is an ancient sarcophagus or tomb. They find all kinds of things as they begin to dig. There's so much you could see here. Very near the theater, here's the theater. It was a little peninsula on which Herod built the palace area with a pool, a swimming pool here. I mean, this is Mediterranean. It's beautiful region. No doubt was an incredible palace. We're standing by the theater looking out at this peninsula. We see some of the pillars of Herod's palace. Here's a reconstruction, a drawn reconstruction of what that palace area would look like. This is where Paul was held prisoner in this palace area. It had prison cells, and where he stood before Felix and Festus and so forth. Acts 23 and following, then the commander of the Roman cohort in Jerusalem called 2 of his centurions. This is up in Jerusalem. Get ready, detachment of 200 soldiers. Paul has been arrested. He's in Jerusalem. Provide mounts for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. And the cavalry arrived in Caesarea. They delivered the letter to the governor in Caesarea and handed Paul over to him. The end of this passage, then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace, the praetorium. Here we have just seen the ruins of Herod's palace. There it is. This is the beautiful swimming pool, the kind of the indoor freshwater swimming pool. And here are some of the columns of that ruin, and perhaps they've uncovered even more now. When 2 years had passed, 2 years Paul is imprisoned here. Felix is succeeded by Porcius Festus. Because Felix wanted to grant favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Skip down. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea. The next day, he convened the court. He took his seat on the bema, literally, which we'll look at in a minute, and he ordered that Paul be brought before him at the bema, which we'll see in a moment. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea. Skip down. They entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city, and at the command of Festus, Paul was brought into the audience hall, where he met with Bernice and Agrippa. They did discover at the palace area a large hall area, which could very well be, I mean, fortunately, nobody's built a church there yet, but this could very well be the audience hall of the palace. It's a large open room where Paul could have stood before Agrippa. This is looking from the palace area straight north to the modern little breakwater right here, where the huge breakwater would have stood out more. And you can see just the edge here of an elongated amphitheater, which is very near both the theater and the palace. And this is where the bema would have been. There's the theater, there's the palace, and here's this amphitheater. And you see this area sticking out into the middle of this huge seating area for the public. And this is the bema, where the ruler would have stood and pronounced judgment against the prisoners. So some of the seating of the amphitheater, where some, contests, arena, where some contests would have taken place and so forth, but also it's where the judgment seat was. The bema you can see sticking out here into the middle of this amphitheater. There it is, the bema, okay? Acts 12, then Herod, different story. This is the one Pastor Jesse read the other day. Then Herod Agrippa, who is the one who killed James, the brother of John, and imprisoned Peter. Herod Agrippa went from Judea, Jerusalem, the hills of Judea, to Caesarea. He stayed there a while. 3 lines down, on the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robe, sat on his throne, sat on the bema, literally, and delivered a public address to the people. He shouted, "This is the voice of a God, not of a man." Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died, sitting right here on the bema, making himself out to be God as a Roman leader. And God said, "No, you're not God," and he dropped dead on the spot because of his egotism and his blasphemy. A lot of public buildings. I could talk about these. This is an interesting one, which we will talk about later during the week. just remember these little pillars standing up in the bottom of this floor. Beautiful mosaic floors, Roman rooms with incredible artistic floors, no doubt artistic walls and ceilings that are gone, a Roman road paved leading down there to the sea and the port. And here is the harbor. This again is the kind of a modern little breakwater there, but the ancient breakwater extended way out into the sea. We're looking from the palace area down the amphitheater, the bema. Here's the breakwater, the modern breakwater, which is about in the area of the ancient breakwater. By the way, this is the Mediterranean. It's just gorgeous to stand there, listen to the waves, feel the breeze. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. It's no wonder the Romans built a huge, huge city there. Here's a great picture, again, of the modern little breakwater, but look at the dark shadow underneath the water and this little opening right here. This is the ancient breakwater, massive, massive breakwater that since has been destroyed. Again, you can see it very clearly in this slide where Roman ships would come from all over the Mediterranean and the Atlantic and so forth and port here. This became an incredible commercial and political center. Here's the mock-up of that huge port. Here is an aerial view. We're going to quickly do the Crusader Fort and the Hippodrome, and we will move on. The Crusaders, as they built their fortresses, one of the reasons I took this picture, because when you think of forts and you think of walls, you can also think of moats, right? But there were such moats that were called dry moats. They didn't have, when I'm a kid, I think of a moat, it had water in it, and there's a drawbridge and so forth. There were dry moats. This was a dry moat. The drop here from ground level is, I'm going to estimate here, 15, 20 feet. I'm not sure. It's a pretty good drop. And then here's the fortified walls. And see this slanted wall that's called a glacis, Glacis, a glacis. And we're going to see a glacis in Jerusalem that probably supported the Palace of David. But this is one of the protective, it's both a retaining wall, but also a protective wall because it's very hard to get up this slanted wall in order to defeat the city fortified inside. So here's a dry moat with a glacis, and I want you to kind of picture that in your mind. Here is it's not a drawbridge now. They built a bridge across to the gate. When you enter a city, I wish I had time to talk more about this right now. We'll see it later. But when you build a gate into the wall of a city, you don't just bust a hole through the wall and build a gate. So you come across, the drawbridge and you go through a hole and you're in the city. You build a gate complex. A gate complex is a series or a large room outside of the wall that forces you, when you cross the bridge or you're coming to the city, you have to turn into this gate complex. Then you're going to have to make another turn while you're inside this gate complex because that's easier to defend. People who want to break into the city, it's easiest if you can break through the gate instead of trying to get up the glacis, right? But they want to make it as hard as possible to break through the gate. So they make this complex where you have to turn. Let's walk across this bridge. Let's turn left into this doorway that you see here. And this is the kind of thing you see in this Crusader Fort. We had just walked into this door. We had to turn to the left, and then we're going to turn again to our right once we're in there to enter the city. Well, so now if you're going to conquer the city, you break through into the gate complex, but you're standing in this tiny little room. There's a window here with somebody up there with spears and bows and arrows. And if you're here's the way I like to say this to my students, if you're a normal person, you're right-handed. Thank you. And so, your sword is here, your shield is here, and you walk in this door, right? and your sword is here, so your shield is, and these guys are on your right side, right? Your right side is exposed. I kind of wish yesterday in our Sunday school class I would have taught from Psalm 121, because it talks about the Lord being the shield on your right side, or your protector on your right side. Why does it say your right side? Well, there's all kind. I have my students debate that in exegesis, but I think it's because your right side, he's the shade on your right side, because your right side is the most vulnerable side. Your left side's protected. That's why they built gates this way, so that your vulnerable side, you have to turn so that your vulnerable side is exposed and so forth. Well, I shouldn't have done that, but I did it, so there you are. A little taste of Psalm 121. This is the hippodrome. Hippo in Greek means horse. Okay, dog in Hebrew means what? Fish. All right, hippo in Greek means horse. So you're learning some Greek and Hebrew. That's a good thing. This is where they would have had chariot races and all that kind of stuff. When I was there, this had not been excavated. I'm not sure whether it has been now. Let me for a minute talk about the water system at Caesarea. Here is the city that we were just looking at. And what I want you to see in this picture are these lines right here. Because these lines are, when you have a city, you need water. We talked about that at AFEC. So AFEC is there partly because it had water, right? Gushing out of the bottom of it. There's no water at Caesarea gushing out of the ground, so they need water. This is a huge, huge, huge Roman city. You need water for the people to survive. So the Romans, being the engineers and the builders that they were, with all of their slave labor, built, first of all, I think, underground water systems that are coming from the north. What's north of here? Mount Carmel, right? Mount Carmel. And it's north. It's raining up there. And water is flowing off of Mount Carmel. And there are springs on Mount Carmel. But that water has to be brought to Caesarea. And so they engineered these underground tunnels that would bring water. Eventually, they built an aqueduct that brought water from Mount Carmel. Eventually, they put a second aqueduct, because the city is growing. But they're bringing water from Mount Carmel. And this water system is absolutely fantastic to see. Over the years, when the city was abandoned and, left desolate, of course, all of the sand began to blow off of the Mediterranean, and it covered all of this up. Well, eventually they discovered it, but it didn't just cover it up, it preserved it. And so there's this beautiful Roman aqueduct that can be seen at Caesarea. It's just absolutely phenomenal to stand there. Everybody has pictures of this. It's gorgeous to see. The water is running down the troughs here at the top, these arches. And imagine there, you can see just a hair of Mount Carmel there in the distance to the north. And imagine engineering that. I think Mount Carmel, I'm going to say, is 5 miles. It could be 2, it could be 7, it could be 10. I'm not 100% sure, but let's say 5 miles to the north. Engineered so that I think this is dropping, let's say, 2 inches or 5 inches a mile. Think of how that would have to happen for this water to just naturally run down to Caesarea and to supply this city. Here's Mount Carmel way in the distance. Here are the dunes that covered up this beautiful aqueduct, and eventually it was a double aqueduct. We're farther north now. They've uncovered it all the way up to Mount Carmel. There's Mount Carmel right there. This is virtually where this aqueduct begins, running all the way down here to Caesarea. If you look at this slide, you can actually see a second. They built 2. You can see that they built 1 and eventually had to add a second in order to supply all the water they needed. And even before that, here's the aqueduct over here, still partially buried under sand. But before that, I believe it was before that, they had these underground water systems. And there again, in the distance in the haze, you can see Mount Carmel. All right. That's the region of Sharon. Let's talk about the lines of communication. And you've already got a kind of a feel for this. Remember, beginning in Egypt, trunk highway is running slightly inland to avoid the dunes. It's touching the coast at Joppa. It's turning inland to avoid the Yarkon and the swamps of Sharon at Aphek there. Then it's hugging the hills of Samaria to avoid the swamps of Sharon. And it's entering a crack. We eventually run into Mount Carmel. And it's going to enter a crack through Mount Carmel at Megiddo, and it's going to head on toward the Sea of Galilee and the rest of the world. But that's happening. That bumping into Mount Carmel is happening here very close to Caesarea. All right, so we've looked at Philistia, we've looked at Sharon. We have two more to go, and they're very small and they're very short. Let's go to the Plain of Dor. The Plain of Dor is a tiny, tiny little plain. So let's talk about the Plain of Dor and the Carmel Ridge, which I've already mentioned many, many times. You should be very familiar with the Carmel Mountain jutting out there into the sea. Mount Carmel stands 1,742 feet above sea level. I mean, it's right on the sea, right? Jutting up 1,700 feet up into the sky and jutting right out into the sea. It hosts verdant trees and foliage. It's north. It's up in elevation. There are really two rules. It gets more moist. In other words, more rainfall comes the farther north you go. The farther north, the more moisture. The farther south, the less moisture. Well, another rule is the higher in elevation, the more moisture. The lower in elevation, the less moisture. So north and up is a lot of moisture. And now we are north, and now we're also up, right? That's why Galilee is going to be farther north and farther up. It's raining up there all the time. The farther south, the less rain you're going to get. And the farther down in elevation you go, which means when you get over to the Dead Sea, I think I said the Sea of Galilee is, the Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. The Dead Sea is 1,400 feet below sea level. So not only is it east, but it's also down. So the farther north and up you go, the more moisture. The farther south and east you go, the less moisture. And that's why Mount Carmel is verdant. And that's why the future kingdom, the Negev, will be like Mount Carmel in the Plain of Sharon. 1,700 feet above sea level, beautiful foliage and trees all over Mount Carmel. Its thumb is sticking into the Mediterranean Sea. Again, that's why when you see a map of Israel, you see, it's coming down from Lebanon and following the Mediterranean Sea, and then you see this bump, and then it goes back like this down to Philistia. That bump is Mount Carmel sticking out into the Mediterranean. And what that's doing as it juts into the sea, it's making the Plain of Sharon now that comes to an end about that point. It's squeezing that plain, that coastal plain, more and more and more over toward the Mediterranean until you can barely squeeze around Mount Carmel to get on to the north. That's why the main road is going to cut through a pass to get into the Jezreel Valley instead of going on up the coast, because the coast is squeezed in by Mount Carmel, and the Plain of Dor is that little strip of land between Mount Carmel and the Mediterranean Sea as it squeezes into that region. Okay, little room for passage north and south. Mount Carmel is best known for Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal. Guess what? There is a monastery, Carmelite monastery right on the spot where Elijah fought the prophets of Baal. It's really on the highest peak of Mount Carmel. It's a great place to visit and stand and look at the area. We'll see pictures of it down the road. So here's the Plain of Dor, and notice it's that little squeezed in area. Here's Dor. Here's Mount Carmel. And the farther north you get, the more it just constricts you until you can barely get around the end of Mount Carmel here. And this is the tiny Plain of Dor. And there's a little coastal town, also a little tiny port that was the city of Dor. This is the plain of Dor and the city of Dor. We've turned now, we're looking kind of toward the southeast. So here's Carmel jutting out into the sea. Here's the Esdraelon Valley and the Megiddo Pass and all that stuff is over here. This is going to be our next plain, the Plain of Acco. But here's little, Sharon's down here. Here's Dor and this tiny little plain here that squeezes around. This is like 1 block wide here, squeezing around Mount Carmel. There's the plain of Dor. We're standing on Mount Carmel and we're looking down toward the Mediterranean. There's the Mediterranean Sea, the lush trees up on Mount Carmel, and you see this little strip of land right here, which is in fact the plain of Dor, as best you can see it from up on Mount Carmel. Here's Tel Dor. Tel, again, remember, is a mound, a ruined city with no visible evidence anymore until they excavate it. This is Tel Dor. This little bay here that they've created so a few little boats could come in here and they could do some commerce with the rest of the world, but it's a small little port. And here is the Tel itself. There's a kibbutz here, which we stayed at once, which was fantastic because I got to walk all over Tel Dor. Smaller, somewhat secluded, Old Testament era port city. Even then, it did control that narrow pass. So if you are a power in the region, if you have Megiddo and you have Caesarea, or before Caesarea, you have Aphek, you don't want people sneaking around the end of Mount Carmel. Just because you have Megiddo doesn't mean you have everything. So you also want to control Dor. Just because it's the back door. Okay, it's the back door to the coastal plain. All right. So it did control this pass around the tip of Mount Carmel, and because of its location, it was it was fought over by the Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians. It was conquered by David and became a district capital under Solomon. They wanted to control Dor because it was the back door to the coastal plain. Often changing hands, it was conquered by the Assyrians in 732 when the northern tribes of Israel were conquered. This is a picture of the little bay. This is the little bay where little boats could come in, and here's Tel Dor here in the distance. Here are some of the excavations of the ancient city. Again, you can see ruins everywhere you look. But this is controlling that little strip of land that's constricted by Mount Carmel as it juts out into the sea. Even today, you can see some fishing boats here of those who are going out into the Mediterranean, and that's probably their living. Lines of communication. A kind of back road to the northern coast. The next plain we're going to look at north of Mount Carmel is the Plain of Acco. If you want to go from Aphek to the rest of the world, you're going to go through Megiddo, past Jezreel to the Sea of Galilee and out that way, right? But if you want to go to Lebanon, if you want to go to Tyre and Sidon, if you want to stay on the coast, then you're going to go on this back road through Dor. You're going to squeeze around Mount Carmel and get up to the Plain of Asher and Acco and head on to Lebanon, Tyre, Sidon, and so forth. So there is a back road to the northern coast, breaking off of the Via Maris before the Via Maris moves into the Megiddo Pass. This side road breaks off, goes to Dor, squeezes around Carmel, and goes up to the Plain of Acco. Just before entering the Megiddo Pass, this back road leaves the main thoroughfare, squeezes into the Plain of Dor, squeezes around Mount Carmel in order to reach the Plain of Acco. So here comes our main road from Aphek, heading into the Megiddo Pass and onto the rest of the world. But if you're going to the Plain of Asher, if you're going to Tyre Sidon up in Lebanon, then you're going to turn off of the road. You're going to go over to Dor, squeeze around Mount Carmel, and on up to the coast. So this is, again, a back regional road to the coast north of Mount Carmel. Philistia, Sharon, Dor, and our last region, the Plain of Acco or Asher. Let me describe the region first. The Plain of Acco or Asher. Remember, Asher is the tribal name. Tribe of Asher was given this piece of property, right? Acco is going to be the major town, so sometimes it's called the Plain of Acco or Acri. The Plain of Acco or Asher extends from Mount Carmel about 25 miles to the north, where it runs into a steep abutment that also is pressing over toward the Mediterranean Sea. There's this cliff that impedes the way on north. When you get to that cliff, even today, there are some switchbacks that lead up the side of it. When you get to the top, you actually enter Lebanon, the modern country of Lebanon. I mean, it's just a natural division because of the steep cliff that is there. And that is the northern boundary of the coast and of the Plain of Asher and Acco. North of that is Tyre, Sidon, Lebanon, Beirut, and so forth. So it's cut off. The Plain of Asher is cut off in the north by a mountain ridge in southern Lebanon. This plain is excellent for crops and excellent for little ports because why crops? It's flat, it's north, right? It's and it's on the coast. So if there are any little bays or whatever, you can fish and you can do commerce by means of the sea. Most often controlled by the Phoenicians. This was their homeland. Asher was given a very difficult piece of property because it was controlled by the Phoenicians. Any famous class, history, Bible history, famous Phoenician women. One of them, a woman, a Phoenician princess, married a king of northern Israel. His name was Ahab. Her name was Jezebel. Phoenicians, I mean, these are anti-God, godless people. Ahab, the king of northern tribes Israel, married a Phoenician. And so even in the days of Ahab and so forth, the Phoenicians, for the most part, controlled this. Asher had a very hard time ever conquering the Plain of Asher. It was owned by the Phoenicians most of the time. Here it is, this little plain north of Mount Carmel, before these mountains of Lebanon. Notice how they butt all the way over to the sea, and there's just nowhere to go once you get north of the Plain of Acco or the Plain of Asher. To the east here, to our right, are the low hills of Galilee, and here's our coastal plain north of Mount Carmel. All right. We are standing on Mount Carmel. We looked a minute ago farther south at the Plain of Dor. We could just see a little bit of it. Now we're looking more to the north. The modern city of Haifa, by the way, is built on that end of Mount Carmel that juts into the sea. The modern city of Haifa is down. That's what you're seeing here. Haifa. And it's also running up the side of Carmel and down that part that juts out into the sea. That's all the modern city and the suburbs of Haifa. That's what we're looking down at from Mount Carmel. And in the haze in the distance is going to be Acco, and way in the distance, if you can even see, a dark line there are going to be those cliffs of the country of Lebanon. This is the Plain of Asher or Acco. We are driving along that plain. We're looking at the Plain of Asher. We're approaching one of the little villages there. But what I want you to see here is this mountain range now that is jutting out again right up to it's not really butting out into the sea like a thumb as Mount Carmel, but it is butting right up to the sea. And this high mountain and this cliff at the top of that is Lebanon. And so our plain of Asher is this flat area here that we're traveling on as we drive down this coastal road. The cities are only two. Acco or Acre is the major city. Acco was a significant port city north of Mount Carmel in the Plain of Asher. This is the major port city in the northern part of Israel. And of course, mostly it would have been a Phoenician port. The Philistines need their port. That's why they had Ashkelon. The Jews needed their port. That's why they had Joppa. The Romans needed their port. That's why they had Caesarea. And the Phoenicians needed their port. That's why there's Acco. It was in Phoenician hands most of the Old Testament times. It was called Ptolemais. In New Testament times, we read about it in Acts 21:7. And the city of Acco, the region of Acco, the city of Acco, if I can call it that, has played a major role by having been attacked and conquered by Israel, Greece, Egypt, Muslims, Crusaders, Mamluks, Ottoman Turks, Napoleon, and the British. I mean, so if you look again at a map of Israel, as you come from the north, we see Mount Carmel jutting out, that thumb jutting out. But right north of Mount Carmel, you'll see a kind of a C-shaped bay, let's call it. And at the northern edge of that bay, which is now in this satellite image right here, this is the modern city of Acco. The Crusaders and Turks built a fort out here. The ancient tell of Acco is right here. Very few people actually go to and notice the ancient tell, but if you visit, usually you'll go out here on the peninsula and visit the Crusader fortress. Here's Tel Acco, and this is the port then. It's a very natural little port of Acco. The fortress is basically Crusader and or Turkish. So here's the biblical tell. This is actually, I just had a moment to step off the bus and take a picture. We didn't go to the top of it. It's absolutely massive. I wish I had a way to give you a perspective. I was trying to find, you almost can imagine this being a person if you can see that little white thing right there. This is absolutely huge. Or maybe that little white dot there would be about the size of a person. This is an absolutely massive hill on which stood a city that controlled this entire plain north of Mount Carmel. This is where the Phoenicians would have controlled this whole region. We move now over to the point, the peninsula sticking out there, to a Crusader and a Turkish fortress, all kinds of things to see there. We're actually looking now back south toward the Carmel Ridge here in the distance, but let's quickly look at the Crusader fortress. Now, again, we're looking south across this natural bay, and you can see on the horizon there the hills of Mount Carmel as it's jutting out into the sea. Another small little town, very northern edge of the Plain of Asher, is Achziv. It's mentioned in the Bible. Along with Acco, this northern outpost and small port was not conquered by Israel. It remained in foreign hands during much of Old Testament times. It's mentioned in Judges 1:31, some other places, but this was mostly Phoenician country. And now you're right before we get to the country of Lebanon. The plain of Acco led to what's called the Ladder of Tyre and the ascent into Lebanon. Again, as you head north on the plain of Acco, you see this ridge in front of you, and eventually you're going to see some switchbacks going up the side, cut into this kind of chalky ridge. And as you look from a distance, it looks very much like a ladder. It leads up to Lebanon. The first town you come to is Tyre, major city. And so it's called the Ladder of Tyre. I'll show it to you in a moment. Here's Tel Achziv. And again, you'll notice a little natural kind of, these little natural harbors. where they're going to build a small city. We're in the northern part of the Plain of Asher, fertile, water, but it's very small, and eventually is going to, this road heading north is going to be constricted. In fact, it's going to be stopped, as it were, by the ridge up into Lebanon. So the lines of communication, having squeezed around Mount Carmel, the route traversed the Plain of Acco and its cities. It then encountered the mountain scarp of Lebanon. It climbed up this mountain scarp via switchbacks called the Ladder of Tyre. We're looking from Achziv north toward the mountains of Lebanon that are stopping our progress heading north. We're looking at an aerial view of Achziv and the Plain of Asher, and here's that ridge, and here are these switchbacks. When you go on Google Earth and play with it, you can actually see these switchbacks today that go up the ridge, and the top of this ridge, you are essentially entering the country of Lebanon. There's Achziv and the switchbacks of the Ladder of Tyre directly in front of us here. Let's hop down on the road. And I have had the privilege one time of driving up on our bus, the Ladder of Tyre, getting to the top and getting some pictures. We're climbing right into Lebanon at this point of time. Here comes our road around Mount Carmel and past Acco and Achziv, climbing up the Ladder of Tyre, and now we have left the land of promise. We're standing atop. We've driven up to the top. We've turned around. We're looking south. Now back toward the Plain of Asher, Achziv, Acco, and way in the distance, in the horizon, you can see Mount Carmel jutting out into the Mediterranean. And now we have traveled from Gaza to Lebanon, and we have done the coastal plain. We need to remember, God sculpted, I love that word, God sculpted every plain, every ridge, every valley, every hill. And it's not an easy land. It is not an isolated land. It's not free of political tension. It's not free of secular filth and godlessness. It's full of all that stuff. But God put Israel right there in Canaan because he had a purpose. He didn't want it to be easy for them, because when it's easy for us, what do? I don't know about you. You're probably not like me. But when things are easy, I don't have to think about the Lord so much. I can take care of this problem myself. Everything's fine. I don't need to pray. I don't need to read my Bible. I'm doing okay. And then things crash and burn, and what do? What are we driven to? It's like in Sunday school class. We're driven to the Word of God because God wants us to know him. God wanted them to know him. God wanted them to trust him. He wanted them to love him. He wanted them to obey him. And that's why he put them in this place. And I hope this week you fall in love with this place. It makes more sense to you. You read your Bible in a new way. And now we have one little piece of the puzzle, the coastal plain.